You see, my friends, one of the deepest and most invisible wounds in the human psyche is not the wound of hatred, but the wound of conditional love. It is the quiet poison that seeps into the soul of a child who learns, not through words, but through atmosphere, that love must be earned. That affection arrives only when the small self obeys, pleases, conforms, such achil, while outwardly radiant in virtue, inwardly begins the slow death of authenticity. He becomes a gardener of other people's expectations, pruning away his own wild roots to make room for approval. When we speak of obedience, we must not imagine the noble discipline of the spirit or the sacred humility of moral order. I speak instead of that obedience born from fear, the obedience of the soul that trembles before withdrawal, that bends not out of love, but out of terror of losing it. In such a state, obedience becomes a psychic cage, and the child a prisoner of his own yearning. The tragedy is that he will grow into an adult who confuses fear with morality, submission with virtue, and compliance with love. When a child is loved only when obedient, his psyche performs a subtle alchemy. It splits the self, the totality of who he is, fragments into two figures. One remains on the surface, smiling, adjusting, anticipating the parent's moods like a clairvoyant servant. The other is exiled to the depths, dark and unsanctioned, holding all the impulses, desire, and instincts that were forbidden. The first becomes the persona, the mask adapted to survive in the world. The second becomes the shadow, the buried twin, rejected but alive, waiting for recognition. What this child learns is not love, but performance. He discovers that to be loved, he must not be himself. And so he begins the long apprenticeship of pretending, mastering the art of silence, of the correct smile, of the strategically timed apology. His early life becomes a rehearsal for adulthood, where he will wear countless masks but never know his own face. And though he may receive admiration, status, and even affection, none of it will ever reach the true center, because that center was abandoned long ago in the dim corridors of childhood, where obedience replaced authenticity as the price of belonging. In the language of depth psychology, such a wound generates a complex, a constellation of emotion, memory, and instinct revolving around the theme of conditional worth. This complex becomes autonomous. It thinks and feels as though it were a second personality within the psyche. Whenever the adult encounters authority, intimacy, or expectation, this complex awakens. It whispers, "Be good, be pleasing, do not disappoint." And without awareness, the person obeys even when no parent is present. This is how the inner tyrant is born, a voice inside that demands perfection in exchange for safety. You might ask, what happens to the shadow that forms in this process. What becomes of the unloved, unapproved self that was banished? It does not die. Nothing psychic ever dies. It merely transforms. The shadow becomes the hidden repository of all that is unlived, the courage, the anger, the sexuality, the spontaneity, the divine wildness. But since it was condemned, the conscious ego now fears it. The adult becomes haunted by his own authenticity. He feels anxiety in the presence of freedom, guilt in the face of joy, shame when he expresses desire. He becomes addicted to control because obedience was his first language. And so an entire life may unfold as an unconscious ritual of avoidance, avoiding the inner rebellion that threatens to expose the lie. The individual marries someone who demands the same obedience or works in a system that rewards compliance and punishes individuality. He may even project his buried shadow onto his own children, demanding from them the same obedience he once offered, thus perpetuating the ancestral pattern. This is how the unlived life of one generation becomes the unconscious destiny of the next. The psychology of obedience is, at its root, the psychology of fear. It is not the fear of punishment, but the fear of abandonment, the primordial terror of being unseen. The child who was loved only when obedient learned to equate visibility with danger. Every time he expressed his true self, love retreated. Every time he complied, love returned. This pattern engraves itself into the nervous system, forming what we call a neurotic pattern of adaptation. And what begins as survival in childhood becomes self-betrayal in adulthood. But we must understand that the psyche, in its mysterious wisdom, always seeks wholeness. What was repressed will find a way to return, for the unconscious does not tolerate imbalance forever. The unloved child inside the adult begins to speak through dreams, through symptoms, through relationships that mirror the original dynamic. You will notice, perhaps, how often the obedient one attracts partners who are critical or distant, or bosses who demand unending perfection. These are not coincidences, but orchestrations of the unconscious symbolic reenactments designed to bring the buried wound into consciousness. When I worked with patients who suffered from this kind of inner division, I often observed a strange phenomenon. They could recount their trauma with perfect lucidity, yet their voices carried no emotion. It was as if they were narrating someone else's story. This is because their feeling function had been sacrificed at the altar of obedience. To feel deeply would mean to rebel against the early injunction to please. The obedient child learned not to feel because feeling was dangerous. Feeling might lead to crying, to protest, to know and know threatened love. Thus, emotional anesthesia becomes the armor of survival. The great paradox of such a life is that the person becomes both the victim and the perpetuator of control. Having once been trained to obey, he later demands the same obedience from himself and others. He may become scrupulous, rigid, excessively moral, even self-sacrificing virtuous. Yes, but virtues twisted by fear, his goodness becomes a form of bondage. He cannot bear to disappoint, and thus he cannot live freely. And yet, society rewards such a person, calling him responsible, reliable, mature. In truth, he is still a child, but now the parent lives inside him in dreams. This inner dynamic often appears as a stern authority figure, a father, teacher, priest who watches, judges, and commands. The dreamer may find himself back in school, failing an exam, or being told he must not speak. These images are not mere memories, they are archetypal. They represent the internalized God of conditional love, a deity of fear, who promises acceptance in exchange for submission. Liberation begins only when one recognizes that this inner God is false, that love which demands the death of the self is not love, but possession. You see, the journey of individuation, the process of becoming whole, always involves a descent into disobedience, not rebellion for its own sake, but the sacred defiance of discovering one's own law to become oneself is, in some sense, to betray all the false loyalties that once ensured survival. The obedient child must die so that the free soul can live. This death is not literal, but psychological, a crucifixion of the persona, followed by the resurrection of authenticity. But such transformation is never painless. The obedient child does not vanish quietly. He clings to life, whispering that chaos will come if he lets go. He fears the freedom he once longed for. And so many people hover at the threshold of individuation, yearning to be free, yet terrified of their own strength. They oscillate between obedience and rebellion, never realizing that both are reactions to the same wound. True freedom lies beyond both, in the quiet recognition that love need not be earned. As the lecture hall grows still, I would ask you to reflect. When you act kindly, is it from love or from fear of losing love? When you say yes, is it because your soul consents, or because the ghost of your childhood still trembles before rejection? To awaken is to notice these subtle movements within the psyche and to trace them back to their origin, the moment when love became conditional and the self withdrew into exile. Yet even in this exile, something divine endures. For the self, the central archetype of wholeness, cannot be destroyed. It watches patiently from the depths, waiting for the ego to tire of its masks. And one day, perhaps through suffering, through a failed relationship, through an inexplicable emptiness, the obedient adult begins to hear a faint voice from within, saying, "You need not please anymore. You need only be." This is the call of the self, the whisper of the eternal within the temporal, inviting you back to your own truth. That, my friends, is where the healing begins, not in rebellion against authority, but in reconciliation with your own soul. You must understand. The psyche never forgets its own exile. What has been rejected in childhood becomes a subterranean current, a hidden river flowing beneath the surface of one's adult life. You might live decades in obedience, walking the path of the good one, and yet somewhere deep below, another life continues. The unlived life, it watches you quietly from the unconscious, gathering power, and sooner or later, what was banished will return. It always does. For nothing in the soul that has once lived can ever truly die. It can only be transformed or repressed. And repression is merely a delay of transformation. When this return begins, it seldom announces itself gently. The obedient one feels a growing restlessness, a subtle discontent that no amount of achievement can soothe. You may wake one day and feel that your life no longer belongs to you, as though every choice you have made was authored by an invisible script written long ago by someone else's expectations. This is the beginning of the descent. The shadow stirs. It whispers, "You have obeyed enough." But the ego, still bound by the old covenant of fear, resists. It says, "No, obedience is love. Rebellion is danger." And thus begins the sacred conflict between the false peace of obedience and the dangerous freedom of authenticity. In mythic language, this is the moment when the hero leaves the village and enters the forest, the unknown terrain of the unconscious. Every myth that has ever moved humanity is a retelling of this inner event. For the forest represents the shadow, the place where all forbidden truths dwell. To step into it is to face the gods and demons of your own psyche. You will meet the forgotten child who once wept in silence, the angry one who was never allowed to speak, the sensual one who was taught to be ashamed, the powerful one who was told to stay small. They will not greet you politely. They will rage. They will accuse you of betrayal, and they will be right, for you have abandoned them in order to survive. The obedient person fears the forest because he has been told all his life that obedience is safety and freedom is chaos. But the paradox of psychic growth is that safety is precisely what prevents transformation. The psyche, like the seed, must break its shell to grow. The seed does not call this destruction, it calls it becoming. And so, when your own shell of obedience begins to crack, you must not cling to the fragments. Let the breaking happen. It is not a failure. It is the soul remembering its own power. During this descent, the dreams begin to change. Those who were once obedient often dream of rebellion, of shouting, of running, of being pursued by faithless authority. They wake in terror, mistaking the dream as punishment. But these dreams are not punishments. They are liberation rituals performed in the theater of the unconscious. The psyche is rehearsing what the waking ego still fears to do, to disobey, to speak, to lie. The chase in the dream represents the old moral code still trying to reclaim dominion. But each time you run, each time you resist, you reclaim a piece of your lost vitality. You see, the shadow is not evil, it is merely unlived. It contains all the qualities that were sacrificed for acceptance. The child who was praised for being quiet buried his passion. The one rewarded for humility buried his pride. The one adored for selflessness buried his desire. These buried aspects are not sinful. They are sacred fragments of wholeness. The task is not to destroy the shadow, but to integrate it, to allow its energy to re-enter life in a conscious way. This is what I have called the process of individuation, the alchemical marriage between light and dark, obedience and defiance, the persona and the shadow. But here is the danger. When the shadow returns suddenly, without consciousness, it erupts in destructive forms. The once obedient may swing to the opposite extreme, becoming reckless, cruel, self-indulgent, mistaking rebellion for freedom. They have not yet learned that true liberation is not the negation of obedience, but its transformation. They must pass through the chaos without becoming chaos. They must burn but not be consumed. This stage of the journey is symbolized in alchemy by the nigredo, the blackening, the dark night of the soul. Everything you once identified with collapses. The moral scaffolding that once held you upright begins to crumble. You may find yourself alienated from your family, your work, even your own reflection. Depression, confusion, and solitude accompany this phase. It feels as though you are dying, and indeed, you are. The obedient self is dying, and the authentic self has not yet been born. This in-between state is the crucible of transformation, and most flee from it. But those who remain, who allow the darkness to do its work, emerge transfigured. In the nigredo, the psyche purifies itself of illusion. The false god of conditional love is dethroned. You begin to see that the love you once chased was not love at all, but control disguised as care. You see how you mistook submission for connection, how you confused silence with peace. You see how obedience, once your salvation, became your prison. These realizations are painful, but they are the price of freedom. The truth is rarely comfortable. It is the sword that divides, and yet only through this division can the soul reclaim its unity. There is often anger in this phase, anger at parents, at society, at God, but beneath the anger lies grief. Grief for the self that was never allowed to exist. When the obedient person finally grieves, the entire psychic architecture trembles, for grief is rebellion against the demand to be fine. To cry is to break the pact of silence. In tears, the soul begins to speak its native language again. And as it speaks, the hardened soil of obedience softens, allowing new life to root. Then something miraculous occurs. The same authority that once judged and condemned begins to transform. In dreams, the stern father may appear less threatening, or the cold mother may offer warmth. These are signs of integration, the reconciliation of opposites. The internal tyrant yields to the inner wise one. The archetype of authority, once distorted by fear, is redeemed into its true form, guidance without domination. The psyche, having survived its own underworld, begins to build a new kingdom, not based on obedience, but on inner alignment. When this stage matures, you begin to notice a strange freedom. You no longer obey because you must. You act because your actions arise from an inner necessity. What was once external law becomes inner law. You have not rejected obedience, but consecrated it. This is a transformation of fear into reverence, true obedience, the kind that the soul demands, is not submission to others, but alignment with one's own truth. To obey the self is to participate in the divine order. It is the obedience of the artist to the vision of the mystic, to the call of the lover to the beloved. It is obedience born from love, not fear. But to reach this point, one must first pass through rebellion. The soul must learn to say no. No to false love. No to manipulation. No to the voices that say, you are good only when you please. Each no is a sacred word, an exorcism that frees the psyche from its ancient spell. And as you practice this no, something within begins to glow. You realize that love, when real, has never required you to shrink, that the divine, when true, never demanded the sacrifice of your essence. The God of the obedient child was a projection of fearful parents. The God of the liberated soul is the self-infinite. Vast and unconditionally embracing. When the audience listens to me speak of these things, I can sense the tremor in their hearts. They recognize themselves in these archetypes, the child who obeyed, the adult who still does, and I tell them gently, the way back to wholeness is not to despise the obedient child, but to thank him. He saved your life. He learned the language that kept you connected when abandonment was death. But now his work is done. You must release him with gratitude. Tell him that love no longer depends on performance. Tell him that his fear is no longer your compass. Tell him he is free. The soul does not evolve through rebellion alone, but through understanding. Every phase of your obedience was a stage in the great alchemical process, the transmutation of innocence into consciousness. You obeyed because you needed to belong. You rebel because you need to be free. You integrate because you need to be whole. This is the spiral of individuation, the endless rhythm by which the human being becomes divine through self-knowledge. And so, my friends, the rebellion of the soul is not an act of defiance, but of remembrance. You are not becoming something new. You are returning to what you always were, before fear taught you to forget. The descent into the shadow, as painful as it is not the end of the journey. It is the turning point, the midnight of the soul, after which dawn must come. Once you have faced the demons of obedience, the fear of rejection, the terror of displeasing, the anxiety of being seen, the psyche begins to reorganize itself around a new center. The child who once obeyed out of fear now begins to remember what love felt like before it was conditional. This is not a sentimental return to childhood. It is a sacred reconciliation with the forgotten innocence of being. When you meet the inner child in this stage of healing, you do not meet a fragment of the past, but a living archetype, the eternal child, the pur eternus. He is both fragile and divine, wounded and luminous. He is the seed of renewal within the old tree of obedience. You may encounter him first in dreams, a small figure watching you from afar, hesitant to approach, uncertain if you are safe. He carries the memory of every time you betrayed yourself to earn love, and yet, in his eyes, there remains a light untouched by fear, the original spark of the self. To heal is to approach this child not as a rescuer, but as a listener. The obedient adult must kneel before the child he once was and say, "I hear you now." He must allow the tears, the rage, the longing that were once forbidden. He must let the child speak all the truths that obedience silenced. Only then can love begin to flow again, not as reward, but as recognition. The psyche, like nature, blooms where it is acknowledged. What you acknowledge becomes real. What you ignore becomes shadow. You see, the wound of conditional love can never be healed by finding someone to love you perfectly. That is the great illusion of the wounded adult, to search for in others what was denied in childhood. But no human being can give you what your own soul has withheld. The love that heals must come from the self, the inner source that transcends all parental figures. It is the love that existed before you learned to perform. The love that does not measure or demand. It is not emotional indulgence. It is ontological recognition, the realization that your being in its totality is already worthy. When the obedient one begins to taste this unconditional love, the transformation is quiet but profound. The nervous system, long trained to anticipate rejection, begins to rest. The body no longer flinches at disapproval. The mind no longer compulsively rehearses apologies. The heart no longer bargains. You begin to live from a place of inner dignity, not pride, not defiance, but the calm knowledge that love does not need to be earned. You start to act from essence rather than expectation. In therapy, I have seen this shift in the smallest gestures. A woman who has spent her life saying yes begins for the first time to say no, not in anger, but in peace. A man who has always sought validation suddenly laughs when criticized, realizing that the world's approval no longer defines him. These are not acts of rebellion, they are signs of integration. The child has been welcomed home. The inner parent, once harsh and conditional, begins to soften. The psyche becomes a family reconciled. And yet, unconditional love is not an emotion that we manufacture. It is a revelation that arises when duality dissolves. The obedient self and the rebellious self were never enemies. They were two halves of the same whole. One preserved life, the other reclaimed it. One submitted to survive, the other fought to live. In their reconciliation, something greater is born, the wholeness of the self, which loves all that it contains. This love is not sentimental, but cosmic. It embraces both obedience and defiance, light and darkness, joy and pain. It says to each, "You are part of me. You belong." In this love, obedience itself is transfigured. No longer is it a reaction to fear or a strategy for approval. It becomes a conscious alignment with inner truth. When you act from this place, you may appear obedient, but inwardly you are free. You follow the law not because it demands, but because it resonates. The saint obeys God, not out of terror of damnation, but because his heart beats in harmony with the divine will. Likewise, the individuated person obeys the self, the inner God image, out of reverence for its wisdom. This is obedience without submission, discipline without fear. But one cannot reach this form of love without first confronting the counterfeit versions of it. Conditional love disguises itself in many ways as duty, as virtue, as devotion. It says, "I love you if," or "I love you because." Unconditional love says nothing. It simply is. To live in this love is to cease performing even for God. It is to stand naked before the mystery and know that your existence, with all its flaws, is already a sacred act. That is the final liberation of the obedient soul, to be loved without earning it. As the healing deepens, your relationships begin to change. You no longer attract those who feed on your compliance. You no longer confuse control with care. The people who demand your obedience fade from your life, for the energy that sustained that dynamic has dissolved. Instead, you draw to yourself those who recognize your authenticity, who love your essence, not your performance. The external world mirrors the inner shift, as it always does, for the outer life is but a projection of the inner myth. This stage of healing often brings solitude. When the mask falls, some will not understand. They preferred the obedient version of you, the predictable one. They may accuse you of arrogance, selfishness, or change. But remember, to those still asleep in obedience, authenticity appears as rebellion. Do not fear their misunderstanding. You are no longer living for approval. You are living for truth. And truth, while lonely at first, is the only companion worth having. There is a sacred paradox here. The more you accept yourself without condition, the more capable you become of loving others unconditionally. The heart that once obeyed out of fear learns to love out of freedom. You no longer demand others to please you, to perform, to obey your expectations. You no longer love their masks. You love their being. This is how generational healing occurs, not through preaching, but through presence. The wound that began with conditional love ends with the transmission of unconditional love. To live this way is to become a vessel of the self. You radiate a quiet authority, not of dominance, but of authenticity. Your words carry weight, because they are not manipulations. They are truth spoken without agenda. People feel safe around you because your love has no hooks. You no longer need them to be anything other than what they are. You no longer need yourself to be anything other than what you are. The war between obedience and authenticity ends. The child and the adult walk together, hand in hand, in dreams. This integration is often symbolized by a marriage, a réunion, or the birth of a child. These are archetypal images of wholeness, the union of opposites, the obedient and the wild, the light and the shadow, the parent and the child all merge into one continuum. What was once fragmented becomes one stream of consciousness. The psyche, having faced its own darkness, now becomes a vessel of light. And this light is not the sterile light of perfection, but the warm glow of humanity, a light that knows its own darkness and therefore loves more deeply. When this realization dawns, obedience itself takes on a new meaning. You realize that all along, even in your conformity, the self was guiding you toward wholeness. Every act of obedience that felt like betrayal was a preparation for awakening. Every time you submitted, you learned humility. Every time you pleased, you learned empathy. Every time you suffered, you deepened your soul. The self wastes nothing. Even your wounds were the instruments of your becoming. What was meant for suppression becomes initiation. And so, unconditional love is not something we achieve. It is something we remember. It is the original atmosphere of the soul, the Eden we never truly left. To live from it is to see through the illusion of separation between good and bad, obedience and rebellion, love and fear. All are movements of the same divine psyche, all expressions of the eternal play between the conscious and the unconscious. When you grasp this, not intellectually but existentially, you begin to see life itself as an alchemical vessel, transforming fear into wisdom, pain into compassion, obedience into freedom. The audience often grows silent here, not out of confusion but reverence, for these are not psychological ideas alone, they are sacred truths. The psyche is not merely personal, it is cosmic. To heal your own obedience is to participate in the healing of humanity's collective wound, the wound of separation from the divine source. Each soul that remembers its unconditional worth becomes a channel through which divine love re-enters the world. This is not theory, it is the living mystery of incarnation. And so I tell you, do not despise your past obedience. It was the chrysalis that allowed the butterfly of your soul to form. Do not rush to destroy it. Let it dissolve when the time comes. The true liberation does not reject the old self, it includes it. You will find that the obedient child still lives within you, but now he no longer serves fear. He serves love, his gentleness, his sensitivity, his desire to connect. These are no longer chains but gifts. What once enslaved you now becomes your strength. That is the miracle of the psyche. It transforms poison into medicine, shadow into gold, obedience into grace. There comes a moment after the long descent and the painful rebirth when you begin to see the entire architecture of your obedience not as a mistake, but as a design. What once felt like tragedy now reveals itself as initiation. You recognize that your childhood wound, being loved only when obedient, was not merely a personal misfortune, but a mythic pattern through which your soul sought consciousness. Every psyche, in its own way, travels this path, from innocence to obedience, from obedience to rebellion, from rebellion to integration. This is the archetypal journey of awakening, written in the very fabric of human existence. In the beginning, you obeyed because love was conditional. Later, you rebelled because obedience became unbearable. But now, standing at the threshold of wholeness, you begin to understand that both obedience and rebellion were stages in the same sacred movement, the movement from unconscious dependence to conscious relationship. The obedient child lives under the law of others. The rebel lives against it. The integrated soul lives in harmony with it, because he has discovered the law within. This is the great mystery, that true freedom is not the absence of obedience, but the rediscovery of its sacred function. You see, obedience in its pure form is not submission to authority. It is the listening of the soul to the self. The word obedience comes from the Latin audire, to listen deeply. To be obedient, in the spiritual sense, is to hear the voice of the inner God, the wisdom that rises from the depths of the unconscious. When you were a child, you mistook this divine instinct for the voice of your parents. Their conditional love confused the sacred inner command with external approval. But now, as consciousness matures, you begin to hear again, to listen, not out of fear, but out of reverence for the truth that lives within you. To live in this way is to become attuned to the rhythm of the self. You act not to please, not to rebel, but because your whole being moves in harmony with an invisible order. It is like music. When you were obedient, you played the notes others demanded. When you rebelled, you struck dissonant chords. But now, you hear the melody that underlies both harmony and dissonance, the eternal song of the psyche. To obey that song is not servitude, it is participation in creation. It is to live as an instrument through which the divine composes. This is why the great mystics always speak of surrender not as defeat, but as union. When Meister Eckhart says, "The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me," he describes the moment when obedience becomes indistinguishable from freedom. For at that depth, the will of the self and the will of the ego are no longer separate. The one who listens and the voice that speaks are one. To obey the self is to obey the totality of life. It is to trust that the current which once carried you into pain now carries you into purpose. But this integration does not erase the wound, it sanctifies it. You will still feel echoes of the old obedience, the reflex to please, the tremor before disapproval. But now, instead of condemning these impulses, you meet them with compassion. You see them as the nervous memories of a soul that once learned to survive through adaptation. You no longer punish the obedient child within. You hold him gently and say, "We are safe now." And by this simple act of mercy, the energy that once fueled fear becomes the very fuel of love. Wholeness is not perfection. It is inclusion. It is the capacity to contain contradiction without splitting apart. The truly individuated person carries within himself both the authority and the submission, both the child and the sage, both the wound and the wisdom. He obeys and commands not as two forces in conflict, but as one rhythm, the inhale and exhale of the soul. This is why the self is symbolized in dreams by the mandala. The circle that holds all opposites in balance, the center of that mandala, is neither obedience nor rebellion, but awareness itself, the silent witness that embraces both. When you reach this awareness, something extraordinary happens. The very people and situations that once triggered your obedience begin to lose their power. You no longer bend reflexively to authority, because authority itself has been internalized. The parent, the teacher, the priest all become inner figures now, integrated into the larger self. You can hear their voices without submitting to them, honor their influence without being possessed by it. You become sovereign, not in arrogance, but in authenticity. The throne you sit upon is not made of dominance, but of consciousness, and yet this sovereignty carries responsibility. The more conscious you become, the more you realize that your personal liberation is never purely personal. Each time you break free from conditional love, you help to dismantle the collective pattern that enslaves humanity. You liberate not only yourself, but the archetype. The obedient child is a universal figure, repeated across cultures and generations. By healing him in yourself, you heal him in the collective psyche. This is why individuation is not selfish, it is service. The self does not awaken for its own glory, but for the redemption of the world. As you embody this wholeness, your very presence becomes transformative. You no longer teach through doctrine, but through being. Those who still live under the spell of obedience sense something in you, a calm, a freedom, a warmth that asks for nothing. You become unconsciously a mirror in which they glimpse their own potential for authenticity. In this way, your healing becomes contagious. The love that once demanded conformity now radiates acceptance. The circle completes itself. You were once loved only when obedient. Now you love others even when they are not. What was once a wound becomes a blessing. And perhaps this, finally, is the meaning of suffering, that it teaches the soul to love more deeply. Without the wound of conditional love, you would never have sought unconditional love. Without obedience, you would never have discovered the sacredness of disobedience. Without fear, you would never have known courage. The opposites that tormented you were never enemies. They were the two wings of the same bird. To fly, you needed both. The pain was the price of consciousness, and consciousness is the gateway to grace. At this stage, dreams often show images of returning home, returning to a childhood house, returning to a forgotten garden. These are not regressions, but symbols of integration. The psyche is telling you the journey is complete. What was lost has been found. The house represents the self, the rooms, the many aspects of your being. You walk through them freely now, without fear of the old authorities that once haunted them. In the garden, you see the child playing again, no longer obedient, no longer afraid. He looks up, says you, and smiles. He does not need your permission to be, and for the first time, you realize that love has always been here, not as reward, but as essence. When I speak of these things, I am aware that they cannot be understood by intellect alone. They must be lived. The psyche is not a machine to be repaired, but a mystery to be revealed. You cannot force this transformation. You can only cooperate with it. The alchemist did not create gold. He purified the vessel so that gold could emerge. Likewise, you do not create wholeness. You prepare the psyche for its arrival through honesty, patience, and humility. The rest is grace. And grace, my friends, is the final obedience, the surrender of the ego to the self. But this surrender is not annihilation. It is fulfillment. It is the ego saying, I will no longer resist what I am. When you live in this way, every act, no matter how small, becomes sacred. Washing the dishes, speaking a truth, forgiving a wound, all are expressions of the same divine order. The soul that once obeyed out of fear now obeys out of love, because love has become its law. Look around and you will see the world differently. You will see that every human being, no matter how broken, is engaged in the same invisible struggle to be loved without condition, to become whole. You will feel compassion, not pity, reverence, not judgment, for you will know that the line between obedience and rebellion, between victim and tyrant, between wounded and healer, runs through every heart. To see this is to see with the eyes of God. And so, as our time draws to a close, I leave you with this. Your obedience was never a failure. It was a language through which life spoke to you, guiding you toward consciousness. The love you sought was never lost. It was hidden in the very act of seeking. To awaken is not to find something new, but to remember what you have always known, that love does not depend on perfection, that worth does not depend on obedience, and that freedom is not rebellion, but understanding. When the obedient child within you finally understands this, he does not vanish, He takes your hand, and together you walk into the morning. The world looks the same, but everything has changed. The sky, once indifferent, now feels intimate. Every breath feels like forgiveness. Every heartbeat whispers, "You are loved." Not because you obey, not because you rebel, but because you exist. And that, dear friends, is the eternal truth. The soul has been trying to teach you all along